In 1991, a 21-month-old girl vanished from her home in Fort Worth, Texas. No witnesses, no ransom note, no trace of where she went. For 20 years, her name lived on in missing child databases and family prayers, a mystery that confounded every detective who tried to solve it. But when the truth finally surfaced in 2011, it defied every assumption about time, distance, and the power of modern science. Because the girl everyone had been searching for across the country had never really left Texas at all. In the summer of 1991, the city of Fort Worth was a sprawling urban landscape where working-class families balanced long hours with modest dreams. Among them was Alta Apantenko, a 22-year-old single mother trying to rebuild her life. She had recently separated from her husband, Jeffrey Hymeth, and was raising their daughter Melissa alone. The little girl had just turned 21 months old, with bright eyes and a smile that lit up every room. Alta worked as a waitress at a busy diner on the east side of town. She took double shifts whenever possible to make rent for the small apartment she shared with a roommate. Affordable childcare in Fort Worth was rare in those days, and reliable babysitters were even harder to find. Pressed for time and options, Alta decided to do what many young mothers did in that era. She placed a classified advertisement in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper looking for a responsible caregiver. The ad was short and practical, requesting weekday babysitting for a toddler in the Seminary Drive area. It was a routine act, the kind made every day by thousands of parents across America. Alta could not have known that this simple decision would set in motion one of the longest missing child cases in Texas history. Within days of the ad running, she received a phone call from a woman who identified herself as Ruth Johnson. The voice on the line was calm, polite, and carried an air of quiet confidence. Ruth explained that she had years of experience caring for young children and lived in a spacious house with a large fenced yard. She sounded professional, even reassuring in her tone and manner. The two women arranged to meet in person at Alta's workplace so she could evaluate the potential babysitter face-to-face. But when the scheduled day arrived, Ruth never appeared at the diner. Instead, she called again later that evening, apologizing profusely for the inconvenience and insisting she was still very interested in the position. Her persistence and seemingly sincere tone gradually lowered Alta's guard. With no family members living nearby and her work schedule becoming increasingly demanding, Alta reluctantly agreed to hire Ruth over the phone without ever meeting her in person. It was a decision that at the time seemed harmless, even practical given her circumstances. If you've ever made a choice that seemed small in the moment but changed everything, you understand the weight Alta would carry for the next 20 years. On the morning of August 23, 1991, Alta left early for her shift at the diner. She had arranged for her roommate to hand Melissa over to the new babysitter later that morning. Around 9 o'clock, a woman arrived at the Spanish Gate Apartments on East Seminary Drive, where Alta and her roommate lived. The roommate later recalled that the visitor matched the general description Alta had provided over the phone. The woman spoke softly, presented herself neatly, and carried an air of quiet authority. Yet something about her appearance immediately struck the roommate as strange and out of place. It was a blistering Texas summer day, with temperatures already climbing toward 104 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-morning. But the woman who called herself Ruth Johnson was dramatically overdressed for the oppressive heat. She wore long white gloves that covered her hands completely, a scarf tied snugly around her neck, and a wide-brimmed bonnet or head covering that obscured much of her hair and facial features. Her clothing, though clean and well-maintained, appeared deliberately chosen to conceal her identity rather than provide comfort in the sweltering weather. The roommate later described her as looking like someone dressed for church services rather than babysitting a toddler. Those who have ever seen something that doesn't quite fit know that feeling in the gut when something is wrong. Despite the unusual and somewhat unsettling attire, nothing in the woman's demeanor or behavior suggested immediate danger. She introduced herself politely as Ruth Johnson, spoke kindly about children, and seemed composed and confident. The roommate, trusting Alta's prior arrangement and having no reason to suspect foul play, handed little Melissa over to the stranger. Along with the child, she gave the woman a small diaper bag containing diapers, a change of clothes, and a bottle of formula. The entire exchange lasted only a few minutes at the apartment doorway. The woman thanked the roommate politely, turned away while holding Melissa in her arms, and walked calmly toward the parking lot. She climbed into a waiting vehicle and drove away into the hot Texas morning. No one would ever see Melissa Highmith or the woman calling herself Ruth Johnson again. In that moment, a life was stolen, and a family was shattered. When Alta returned home from her shift that evening, she expected to find her daughter asleep in her crib or playing with toys. Instead, the apartment was eerily silent and still. Melissa's toys were arranged neatly in their usual places. Her bottle sat untouched on the kitchen counter, and her crib was empty. At first, Alta assumed there had been some kind of miscommunication or scheduling confusion. Perhaps the babysitter had taken Melissa for a walk in the park or back to her own home nearby. Hours passed with no phone call, no message, no word of any kind. Alta tried calling the number Ruth had provided, but it rang endlessly with no answer. She asked neighbors if they had seen a woman with a toddler, but no one recalled seeing anything unusual. By nightfall, Alta's initial concern had transformed into full-blown panic and terror. Shortly after 8 o'clock that evening, she contacted the Fort Worth Police Department to report her daughter missing. Patrol officers arrived at the apartment within 20 minutes, took detailed statements from both Alta and her roommate, and immediately began standard procedures for a potential child abduction case. They quickly confirmed that no one named Ruth Johnson matched the description provided by the roommate anywhere in Fort Worth. There was no record of anyone by that name in local employment databases, rental records, or city directories. The roommate's detailed account of the woman's unusual appearance became the only tangible lead in the investigation. Detectives noted the white gloves and head coverings as possible indicators of a deliberate attempt at disguise. Forensic analysis capabilities in 1991 were limited compared to modern standards, but even basic reasoning suggested the clothing served a calculated purpose. Gloves would eliminate any possibility of leaving fingerprints on surfaces she touched. Head coverings would effectively conceal hair color, style, and length from witnesses. The entire outfit, viewed in retrospect, appeared less like eccentric fashion choices and more like careful criminal planning. If you think kidnappers are always chaotic and obvious, this case proves how terrifyingly methodical some predators can be. Police immediately canvassed the entire neighborhood around Seminary Drive, interviewing residents and local shopkeepers about anyone matching the description. No one recalled seeing a woman in such distinctive clothing carrying a toddler that morning. Officers checked local bus stations, taxi company dispatch records, and hospital emergency rooms. They even organized searches of wooded areas and drainage ditches along the nearby interstate highway, but no physical evidence of Melissa surfaced anywhere. No discarded clothing, no baby items, no vehicle descriptions, nothing at all to work with. The silence was as complete as it was devastating. By the second day of the investigation, the case had drawn immediate attention from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI classified Melissa's disappearance as a likely kidnapping under federal interstate abduction statutes, which gave them jurisdiction to investigate across state lines. Missing person flyers were quickly printed and distributed across Texas and all neighboring states. Local newspapers published front-page articles about the vanished toddler, featuring photographs of Melissa with captions reading, "Missing Fort Worth Child." But despite the rapid response and publicity, the investigation faced severe constraints from the very beginning. There were no security, cameras at the apartment complex in 1991, no digital records to trace, no credit card transactions to follow. The woman who called herself Ruth Johnson had communicated only by landline telephone, most likely from untraceable public payphones scattered throughout the city. Every single avenue of inquiry relied entirely on human memory, and memory fades quickly under pressure. For those who remember the early 90s, you know how different investigations were before the digital age changed everything. Alta underwent multiple rounds of intensive questioning by both local police and federal agents. Investigators needed to rule out any family involvement, which was standard protocol in all child disappearance cases. Her recent separation from Jeffrey Hymeth raised initial suspicions among some officers who wondered about possible custody disputes or parental abduction scenarios. But thorough interviews and verified alibis cleared both parents early in the investigation. There were no ongoing custody battles, no documented history of domestic violence or child neglect, and no indication whatsoever of voluntary disappearance. The investigation had to look elsewhere for answers that seemed impossible to find. Community volunteer searches were quickly organized in the days immediately following Melissa's abduction. Dozens of concerned citizens combed methodically through vacant lots, city parks, and residential neighborhoods surrounding the apartment complex. Nothing was found despite their best efforts. Local churches held emotional prayer vigils for the missing child's safe return. Television news stations aired repeated appeals for information, showing footage of Alta's tearful pleas for her daughter's return. Despite all the media visibility and community support, not a single credible witness ever came forward with useful information. As the weeks slowly passed without any breakthrough, the case grew progressively colder and more frustrating for everyone involved. Police reports noted that all investigative leads had been thoroughly exhausted with no viable suspects identified. The name Ruth Johnson remained nothing more than a phantom identity, a complete fabrication without any connection to reality. The description of the mysterious woman in white gloves became the only defining image of the abduction that anyone could remember. It was a haunting symbol of precision planning and complete anonymity. Privately, frustrated investigators admitted they had reached a dead end in the case. Without a crime scene to process, without a vehicle description to trace, and without any witnesses beyond the brief apartment doorway exchange, there was virtually nothing to reconstruct about what had actually happened. The abduction appeared both devastatingly simple and maddeningly complete in its execution. An unknown woman had arrived at a specific time, taken a specific child, and vanished without leaving behind a single traceable clue. The only certainty investigators could document was that whoever committed this crime had planned every detail carefully enough to leave absolutely no evidence behind. When investigators hit a wall this solid, families are left with nothing but questions that have no answers. For Alta Apantenko, life entered a suspended state of permanent grief and desperate hope. She temporarily quit her waitressing job to cooperate fully with police investigators, spending her days answering endless phone calls, following up on vague rumors, and repeatedly revisiting the apartment as if some overlooked detail might suddenly reveal itself. Her nights were spent lying awake, replaying every single detail of those final days in her mind. The classified newspaper advertisement, the phone conversations with the woman calling herself Ruth, the specific words she had used like large yard and experienced with children. Alta questioned every decision she had made from the moment she placed that ad to the instant she agreed to hire a stranger based solely on phone conversations. The Fort Worth Police Department eventually closed the active daily search operations after several months of intensive efforts. The case file was transferred to the department's cold case division, where it remained officially open but effectively dormant. Detectives would await any new information that might emerge, but no one expected any breakthroughs. As months slowly turned into years, the photograph of the bright-eyed toddler with a bow in her dark hair gradually moved from newspaper front pages to dusty archive files. What endured in everyone's memory was the disturbing clarity of that initial abduction scene. A scorching August morning, a polite but overdressed stranger, and a single decision that irrevocably changed one family's entire history. The woman in white gloves had carried more than just a child away that terrible day. She had taken certainty, security, and peace of mind, leaving behind only unanswerable questions that haunted everyone involved. By the end of 1991, the name Melissa Highmith had officially joined a growing national list of missing children across America. It was a list that reflected both the era's vulnerabilities in child protection and the severe limits of investigative technology available at that time. Yet, among those many tragic cases, Melissa's story would eventually stand out for one specific reason that no one could have predicted. It began not with violence or obvious chaos, but with calculated trust deliberately engineered by a stranger. And that misplaced trust, given to a woman dressed far too carefully for the brutal Texas heat, would vanish as completely and mysteriously as the woman herself had disappeared. But what no one knew in 1991 was that 20 years later, science would finally provide the answers that human investigation could never find. The truth was waiting in a technology that didn't even exist yet. When the investigation into the disappearance of 21-month-old Melissa Highmith began in August 1991, police expected progress within days. In most missing child cases, time was the single most critical factor determining outcome. If no trace appeared within 48 hours, the likelihood of successful recovery declined sharply with each passing day. For Melissa, those crucial hours turned into weeks, then months, and eventually into years. Despite the immediate involvement of both the Fort Worth Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the case went completely cold almost from the very beginning. There was no ransom demand, no pattern consistent with known kidnapping operations, and no physical evidence whatsoever suggesting what had happened to the child. The complete absence of clues became the case's most defining and frustrating feature. Investigators concluded early that the abduction had been carefully premeditated and expertly executed. Yet they utterly lacked the means to track a suspect who had never existed on paper. Ruth Johnson was a ghost, a name attached to no real person anywhere. Alta Apantenko remained under close scrutiny for many months, as was absolutely typical in all child abduction cases nationwide. But investigators ultimately found nothing whatsoever to implicate her in her own daughter's disappearance. Her life, however, became an endless cycle of police interrogation, agonizing waiting, and crushing self-recrimination that never stopped. She kept a framed photograph of Melissa by her bed and replayed every single moment of that terrible morning in her mind thousands of times. The classified advertisement, the phone calls with the woman, the trust she had placed in a complete stranger. Each mental retelling led absolutely nowhere, but she could not stop the cycle of guilt and questioning. The FBI maintained an officially open file under the Federal Kidnapping Act for interstate crimes, but without any concrete evidence of transport across state lines, their jurisdiction remained somewhat limited. By the mid-1990s, new urgent cases replaced older ones in terms of active investigation, and Melissa's thick file gradually slid into the growing backlog of unsolved disappearances that characterized the pre-digital investigative era. The case number remained technically active in police databases, but its forward momentum was completely gone. For those who have watched a case go cold, you know that terrible feeling when hope slowly transforms into helpless waiting. Yet for the Highmouth family, the determined search never truly stopped despite official inaction. Alta and Melissa's biological father, Jeffrey Highmouth, eventually built entirely separate lives with new partners, but they remained connected through a shared, devastating loss that neither remarriage nor passing time could ever erase. Over the next 2 decades, they pursued every single rumor, every vague reported sighting, and every person who claimed to have seen a little girl who looked like Melissa. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, as missing child awareness grew dramatically across the United States, new technologies like computerized age progression sketches offered families limited hope for breakthroughs. The Highmouth family submitted all of Melissa's childhood photographs to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, commonly known as NCMEC. The organization's forensic artists produced several detailed renderings of what Melissa might look like as a teenager, then as a young adult in her 20s. Those computer-generated images appeared regularly in public awareness pamphlets, newspaper feature articles, and television news segments about long-term missing children. Each new release generated tips from concerned citizens, and each tip invariably led to crushing disappointment when investigated. If you've ever followed a lead that seemed promising only to watch it collapse, you understand the emotional toll this cycle takes. Leads came from everywhere across the country and beyond. A woman in Oklahoma City claimed she absolutely recognized her neighbor from the age-progressed sketch published in a local newspaper. A long-haul truck driver in New Mexico swore under oath he had given a ride years earlier to someone who looked exactly like that missing Texas girl. The Highmouth family would drive for hours, sometimes across multiple states, to follow up on these reports personally. They learned through painful experience to temper their natural excitement with extreme caution, because hope had become both their only lifeline and their cruelest punishment over the years. DNA testing, when it first became commercially available to the general public in the late 1990s, added an entirely new dimension to missing person searches nationwide. The Highmouths submitted biological samples to law enforcement databases whenever possible, hoping for a match that would solve the mystery. But the technology in those early years was extremely primitive and highly centralized in a few laboratories. Databases were woefully incomplete, with limited cross-referencing capabilities between different jurisdictions and agencies. Each test result came back with the same devastating answer: no match found anywhere in the system. Still, Alta absolutely refused to let the word closure enter her vocabulary or her thinking. By the late 1990s, public and media interest in Melissa's case had substantially waned after years without developments. News outlets rarely revisited stories that had no new information or updates to report. The Fort Worth Police Department, severely constrained by perpetually limited resources, carried more than 1,000 officially open cold cases at any given time. Many of those files dated back decades with no realistic hope of resolution. At one particularly difficult point, all missing person files for the entire department were assigned to a single overworked detective. It was a logistical impossibility that effectively left most investigations completely dormant, with no active work being done. In the early 2000s, as internet access became widespread, the Highmouth family embraced new online tools as potential game changers. In 2005, Melissa's adult siblings, who had grown up hearing their parents' stories about their missing sister, created a Facebook page specifically called Finding Melissa Highmouth. It served both as a comprehensive digital archive and a public call for help from anyone with information. They posted every known photograph, every newspaper clipping, and every age-progressed rendering that had been created over the years. The page gradually drew significant attention from local Texas communities and national advocacy groups specializing in long-term missing person cases. Through the steady rise of social media platforms, the Highmouth family's story reached entirely new audiences, including amateur genealogists, retired law enforcement officers, and ordinary concerned people fascinated by unsolved cold cases. Online forums such as web sleuths discussed Melissa's case periodically, often meticulously reanalyzing every known detail of the 1991 abduction. The white gloves, the scarf and bonnet, the complete lack of witnesses beyond the roommate. But despite this renewed online awareness and discussion, there were still absolutely no concrete answers or breakthroughs. Every few years brought new waves of public attention, often triggered by another family mistaking a physical resemblance or by the release of updated computer-generated sketches. Some women even came forward sincerely believing they might actually be Melissa Highmouth, their early memories blurred by adoption trauma or childhood confusion. DNA comparison tests always followed these claims, and every single time, the laboratory results returned negative for a genetic match. For Alta, these repeated false alarms carried both renewed hope and devastating emotional impact in equal measure. She learned to read complex laboratory reports with clinical detachment out of necessity, but the emotional toll never diminished over time. Every time the phone rang, "I thought maybe this is finally it," she would later recall in interviews. And then it wasn't. Meanwhile, public opinion toward the Fort Worth Police Department grew increasingly critical over their handling of cold cases. Local newspapers ran pointed editorials questioning how a case so publicly known and so personally devastating could effectively stagnate for 2 full decades without meaningful progress. Community activists demanded greater funding for the city's understaffed cold case unit, arguing passionately that families like the Highmouths were being unfairly left to shoulder complex investigative work entirely by themselves. The department's own official representatives publicly acknowledged that resources were extremely thin and stretched to breaking points. With one detective supposedly handling over 1,000 open files simultaneously, a department spokesperson admitted frankly, "We simply cannot give each individual case the focused attention it truly deserves." Despite bureaucratic inertia and institutional limitations, the Highmouth family's remarkable persistence gradually turned their story into a quiet but powerful symbol of endurance. Every year, on Melissa's birthday in November, the family gathered for a small private celebration complete with a cake, candles, and a wish spoken aloud together. "We will bring you home someday." Alta maintained this tradition faithfully, even when well-meaning friends and relatives urged her to let go and move forward with her life. Neighbors regularly saw her setting a single lit candle by her window each November on Melissa's birthday. When asked by reporters why she continued this ritual after so many years, she answered simply and directly, "Because I haven't seen her body, and until I do, she's not gone from this world." As time passed relentlessly, the emotional weight and practical burden of the search gradually shifted to the next generation of family members. Melissa's biological siblings took over many of the daily search efforts, corresponding regularly with non-profit organizations and online advocacy groups dedicated to finding missing persons. They learned to navigate complex digital record systems, file detailed public information requests with government agencies, and contact emerging genetic testing companies. Yet with each passing decade, the statistical probability of a living resolution continued to diminish, according to experts. Most missing child cases from that era ended in speculation and assumption, not actual recovery. The turn of the millennium also brought a new kind of skepticism among some observers. Some people openly questioned whether Melissa's case had ever been realistically solvable at all, or whether the mysterious woman who took her had died long ago, taking her terrible secret to the grave. But the Hymeth family categorically rejected such fatalistic thinking. The emergence of consumer DNA testing databases gave them renewed purpose and determination. They began actively exploring the field of genetic genealogy, which had started successfully cracking cold cases previously thought completely impossible to resolve. Through all of it, Alta aged quietly but visibly under the weight of 2 decades of waiting. Gray hair replaced brown, lined hands showed years of work, and yet she maintained a calm, steady faith that genuinely confused outside observers. When asked directly how she could still believe in finding Melissa after 20 full years, she replied that belief was not really a choice at all. It was survival itself. "If I stop believing she's alive," she said once to a television reporter, "then I lose her twice." For those who have lost someone without closure, you understand that this kind of faith becomes the only thing keeping you standing. Publicly, the Hymeth story faded in and out of local news headlines over the years. Privately, it remained a constant daily rhythm in one family's life, a presence entirely defined by absence. Even as Fort Worth modernized dramatically, built new highways, and digitized all its municipal archives, one photograph never left the bulletin board inside the police department's cold case division. A smiling toddler in a white dress looking at a camera in 1991. By 2010, the case file had been officially reopened and comprehensively reviewed several times by different detective teams, but with absolutely no progress or new leads emerging. Detectives confirmed that all original evidence from 1991 had been carefully preserved in storage. What little physical evidence existed, anyway. The case remained officially listed as one of the longest unresolved child abductions in Texas history. For investigators, it represented a procedural and technological failure of the system. For the Hymeth family, it was something else entirely, a measure of faith that absolutely refused to expire. 2 decades after that terrible morning in August 1991, the world had changed beyond recognition. Technology had advanced exponentially, policing methods had evolved dramatically, and communication had been revolutionized by the internet. Yet the same fundamental unanswered question still lingered over everything. Where is Melissa Hymeth? And when the answer finally began to form, in 2011, it would not come from a police station, a cold case file review, or traditional detective work. It would come from a revolutionary tool that had not even existed in 1991, a simple strand of DNA uploaded to a commercial website by a father who had never stopped searching for his lost daughter. By early 2011, the disappearance of Melissa Hymeth had become one of the oldest unsolved child abduction cases in the entire United States. For most families facing such tragedies, these stories eventually fade quietly into the background of time, buried beneath new generations and inevitably changing priorities. But the Hymeth family had never stopped searching for answers, and the substantial digital footprint they had carefully built online kept Melissa's case alive long after mainstream public attention had moved on to newer mysteries. That year, a small but completely unexpected event would reignite both desperate hope and renewed national awareness. In September 2011, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received an anonymous tip from Charleston, South Carolina. The caller claimed to have recently seen a woman who strongly resembled one of the age-progressed computer images of Melissa that had been widely circulated by the organization over the years. The physical description seemed genuinely plausible to investigators reviewing the tip. The woman was reportedly in her early 20s, with distinctive facial features remarkably similar to the digital reconstruction that forensic artists had created. When the tip was forwarded to Fort Worth authorities, they immediately passed the information along to the Highmith family. For Alta's surviving children, now adults with their own families and responsibilities, it felt like a credible moment worth pursuing, despite years of disappointments. It sounded real this time, one sibling later told local newspaper reporters. We had heard so many rumors over the years, but something about this one felt genuinely different. The family pooled their limited savings together, purchased plane tickets on short notice, and flew to South Carolina within just days. They printed hundreds of flyers featuring photographs of Melissa as a baby and computer projections of how she might appear today. Local Charleston news stations quickly picked up the compelling story, turning their arrival into a small but significant media event. Television interviews with concerned residents aired under headlines like, "Could missing Fort Worth girl be living in Charleston?" For several days, hope ran high that this might finally be the breakthrough everyone had prayed for. But the optimism was tragically short-lived and ultimately unfounded. Within 1 week, comprehensive DNA comparison testing confirmed definitively that the woman in question was not Melissa Highmith at all. Once again, the family's carefully guarded optimism collapsed completely under the crushing weight of negative laboratory results. If you've ever had hope snatched away just when you thought you'd found answers, you know that particular kind of devastation. Ordinarily, this disappointing outcome would have marked the end of yet another exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment. It was a familiar pattern that had repeated itself countless times over the previous 20 years. But something about this particular false lead had an unexpected and different effect on the family. The trip to South Carolina had reminded the Highmiths how modern technology and focused media attention could still mobilize concerned people even after 2 full decades. It also made them realize that while traditional police investigative work had completely failed them, scientific capabilities had advanced far beyond recognition since 1991. Back in Texas, Melissa's biological father, Jeffrey Highmith, began seriously reading about consumer DNA testing kits. Services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA now allowed ordinary people to trace their ancestry and potentially locate unknown biological relatives through genetic matching. The family had certainly heard of such tests before through news coverage, but never seriously considered them relevant to their situation. In their minds, DNA testing was something exclusively done by professional law enforcement agencies and crime laboratories, not by desperate families searching on their own. They had always assumed their genetic information would never reach the official databases maintained by police. But in late October 2011, after the disappointing South Carolina tip had been definitively ruled false, a close family friend who was an amateur genealogist urged Jeffrey to seriously reconsider this approach. "You have tried absolutely everything else over 20 years, she told him directly. "Why not try this?" The process was remarkably simple for something so potentially powerful. A small saliva sample mailed to a laboratory, then analyzed through sophisticated algorithms that compared genetic markers to millions of profiles already in the company's massive database system. The statistical odds of finding a meaningful match were admittedly quite small, but they existed nonetheless. For the Highmith family, after 20 years of dead ends, even 1% possibility was infinitely better than none at all. Those who have ever grasped at a last hope understand why even tiny chances matter. On November 15, 2011, exactly 3 weeks after submitting his DNA sample, an email notification arrived in Jeffrey Highmith's inbox. At first, he naturally assumed it was just a standard automated notification about ancestry results or ethnic background percentages, nothing particularly unusual or life-changing. But when he opened the message and read the text on his computer screen, The words were absolutely unmistakable in their significance. DNA match found. Direct parental relation confirmed. The match was not directly with Melissa herself, which would have been immediately conclusive. Instead, it was with 3 adult individuals who shared his genetic DNA in a very specific way. The system clearly listed them as having a genetic relationship entirely consistent with a grandparent-grandchild biological connection. Jeffrey read that critical line several times, not fully comprehending what it actually meant at first. Then he immediately called one of his adult daughters who had been managing the family's ongoing online awareness campaign. They compared notes carefully, reread the technical data multiple times, and checked the names associated with the matching account. The profound implications hit them slowly, but with tremendous force. Whoever these 3 mystery people were, their biological mother had to be Melissa Highmith. The next crucial step was independent verification of these results. The family immediately contacted 23andMe's customer support team, carefully explaining their extraordinary situation and asking how they could confirm this genetic connection beyond any doubt. Privacy rules strictly limited the personal information the company could legally release about other users. But through the platform's internal messaging system, they were able to send a carefully worded note to the account holder linked to the matching genetic profiles. While anxiously waiting for any reply, the Highmiths began working closely with Lisa Jo Shiel, a clinical laboratory scientist and highly experienced genealogist who had volunteered to help families interpret complex DNA data. Shiel thoroughly examined the raw genetic results and confirmed their scientific validity without any doubt. "There is absolutely no mistake here," she told them with complete confidence. "The probability that these individuals are not biologically related to Jeffrey is effectively 0. The genetic trail pointed directly back to Fort Worth, Texas. Not to another state, not to another country, but to the exact same city where Melissa had mysteriously vanished 20 years earlier. That discovery alone completely stunned everyone involved in the search. "We had searched the entire world," Jeffrey would later recall emotionally. "But she had been right here the whole time." It was a conclusion almost too surreal to process mentally or emotionally. The family had spent 2 full decades looking outward, searching across maps and borders and state lines. Yet the answer had apparently been within driving distance the entire time. For those who have searched far away for something close by, you know that strange mixture of relief and anger. But before they could be absolutely certain, they needed to definitively identify the woman genetically linked to the DNA match. Using publicly available records and social media search techniques, Shiel and the Highmith family carefully traced the DNA connection to a woman living under the name Melanie Walden in Fort Worth. Her documented date of birth aligned closely with Melissa's known birthday. She had 3 adult children, the exact same 3 individuals who appeared in the DNA database matching Jeffrey. Even with all this compelling evidence, the family hesitated to celebrate prematurely. They had been through too many devastating false hopes over 20 years to assume this was real without absolute proof. Jeffrey decided to contact Melanie directly through Facebook Messenger with extreme caution. His message was deliberately short and carefully worded. "Hi, my name is Jeffrey Highmith. I believe I may be your biological father. I have been searching for my daughter Melissa for 20 years. For Melanie Walden, this bizarre message appeared completely out of nowhere in her inbox. She initially dismissed it as an elaborate internet scam or cruel hoax. The absurd idea that someone could claim to be her father after 2 decades with absolutely no warning sounded ridiculous. She ignored the message completely. Several days passed with no response from her. Then her husband, curious about the strange claim, searched for the name Melissa Highmith online out of pure curiosity. He quickly found the Finding Melissa Highmith Facebook page filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, and detailed case information spanning 20 years. When he slowly scrolled through the archived images, one particular photograph caught his attention and literally stopped him cold. A baby, picture that looked unmistakably, impossibly similar to his wife's own childhood photographs. The resemblance was simply impossible to ignore or dismiss. He showed the image to Melanie in complete silence, unable to find words. She stared at the screen for a very long time without speaking. The birth date matched perfectly. The approximate age matched. Even a small distinctive birthmark visible near one eye matched her own. Something profound inside her shifted dramatically from complete skepticism to genuine shock. If you've ever discovered your entire life story might be false, you understand the ground disappearing beneath your feet. Meanwhile, Jeffrey and his anxious family waited desperately for any response to the message. Then, late one evening, a notification finally appeared on his phone. "Melanie Walden has replied to your message." The brief exchange that followed was life-changing for everyone involved. She agreed to speak cautiously by phone and to seriously consider independent DNA testing for absolute confirmation. The Highmiths, overwhelmed but extremely wary of yet another crushing disappointment, immediately arranged for a comprehensive follow-up test through an independent certified laboratory. At that crucial point, no one outside the immediate family knew what was happening behind the scenes. Police had not yet been officially notified of any developments. The media had absolutely no idea a breakthrough was occurring. After 20 full years of very public appeals and searches, the most significant breakthrough in the case was occurring quietly between strangers exchanging messages on a social media platform. For Jeffrey, the realization was still far too enormous to accept emotionally. "I did not know what to believe anymore," he later said in interviews, "but the science does not lie. The numbers were absolute. For the very first time in 20 years, there was something genuinely solid to hold on to. Not a vague rumor or questionable sighting, but actual proof." By late November 2011, the family prepared nervously to meet the woman they now believed was Melissa. Before any meeting, they arranged one final DNA verification test, not through a consumer platform, but through a formal accredited laboratory specializing in legal paternity testing. The results would take several agonizing days to process. During that tense waiting period, Alta, now in her early 40s, was carefully told about the possible match. After 2 decades of devastating loss, she remained extremely cautious about believing. "I have had my hopes raised before," she said quietly. "If it is true, I will know when I see her face." The final confirmation came just before Thanksgiving, one of the most family-centered holidays in American culture. The formal laboratory results matched the 23andMe findings exactly with statistical certainty. The child who had vanished in 1991 was definitively alive today. Her name, her life, her entire identity had all been fundamentally different. But she existed. The most astonishing part was not how far they had gone to find her across 20 years. It was how incredibly close she had been all along, living her life just miles away. Those who believe miracles happen in ordinary moments understand what this family experienced in that instant. The DNA match that arrived in November 2011 had given the Highmith family something they genuinely had not felt in 2 decades. Absolute certainty. Yet certainty alone was not enough after so much time. They needed proof that could stand in court, proof that could withstand any possible challenge or doubt. For that, they turned once again to Lisa Jo Scheel for help. Scheel meticulously analyzed the 23andMe data and systematically cross-checked it with public genetic registries and genealogical databases. The genetic markers were absolutely clear and scientifically irrefutable. The profiles of 3 adults in Fort Worth shared a direct first-degree biological connection to Jeffrey Highmith. When she carefully mapped out the complete family tree using standard genealogical methods, the relationship fit only one possible configuration. They were the biological grandchildren of the man whose daughter had disappeared 20 years earlier. From that solid foundation, Scheel and the family began working backward through public records. Using online databases, historical address records, and social media clues, they systematically traced the genetic line to a woman named Melanie Walden. She had been born in 1989, the exact same year as Melissa Suzanne Highmith. The circumstantial coincidences began to pile up rapidly into overwhelming evidence. Melanie lived in Fort Worth, the same city where Melissa vanished. She was in her early 20s, exactly the right age. Most significantly, her official birth records were incomplete and suspicious, listing no hospital and no formal birth certificate until several years after 1989. Then came the most visually striking detail that removed all remaining doubt. Through careful examination of old family photos and digital metadata from public social media posts, they identified a small, faint birthmark beneath Melanie's left eye. It was identical in size, shape, and location to one clearly visible in Melissa's baby pictures. That was the precise moment it shifted from statistical theory to undeniable reality. Scheel later explained, "There is no algorithm or equation for that kind of visual recognition. It is simply truth. For those who have seen evidence become certainty, you know that moment when everything clicks into place." With all this evidence carefully compiled, Jeffrey sent a cautious but direct message through Facebook. "My name is Jeffrey Highmith. I believe you might be my daughter. I have been searching for Melissa for 20 years. For Melanie, the message had seemed completely absurd at first. She had grown up in Fort Worth, attended local public schools, and lived what she considered an ordinary life. No one had ever suggested her origins were anything unusual or suspicious. Seeing a total stranger claim to be her father felt more like a bizarre hoax than a legitimate revelation." She showed the message to her husband, half amused and half irritated by it. "People will say anything online," she said dismissively. But her husband was genuinely curious about the claim. He searched the name Melissa Highmith online and quickly found the Finding Melissa Highmith Facebook page. It was the comprehensive digital archive the family had maintained faithfully for more than a decade. There, he scrolled through dozens of old photographs, scanned newspaper articles, and public pleas for information. One particular image stopped him completely cold. A baby in a white dress smiling directly toward the camera. The resemblance to his wife was absolutely unmistakable. He called Melanie over urgently. Side by side, they compared the old photograph to her own baby pictures kept in their family album. The eyes, the distinctive shape of the nose, even the small curve of the lips were all identical. There was also the small birthmark perfectly aligned in the exact same location. "That is you," her husband said quietly. For the first time, Melanie did not have any answer to give. The next day, she replied to Jeffrey's message with extreme caution. Her tone was guarded but genuinely open. "I do not know what to think about this, but I saw the pictures. Maybe we should talk." From that pivotal moment, communication moved surprisingly quickly toward resolution. With Scheel's continued guidance, both sides agreed to conduct a formal legal DNA test to remove any remaining doubt whatsoever. The sample collection was arranged privately through a certified laboratory to avoid premature media attention. Within days, the definitive results returned, showing a 99.9929% genetic match between Melanie Walden and her presumed parents, Jeffrey Hymeth and Alta Apantenko. For Alta, the confirmation arrived like a slow, delayed echo, something she had imagined so many thousands of times that it almost did not feel completely real. "They said we found her," she recalled later, "and I just sat there frozen. After 20 years, I did not know how to react." The first meeting was carefully scheduled for Thanksgiving Day, November 24, 2011, at a relative's home in Fort Worth. The symbolism was impossible to ignore for anyone. A holiday built entirely around family and reunion, now marking the end of one of the longest separations in modern American missing person history. When Melanie, still processing her completely rediscovered identity, entered the room, the gathered family fell into complete silence. No introductions were needed at all. Alta recognized her instantly, despite 20 years. "That is my baby," she whispered. There were no prepared speeches, no rehearsed words, just a long, unbroken embrace that seemed to collapse 2 decades between them. Photographs from that emotional day captured 3 generations standing together, a scene that had once seemed utterly unthinkable. 2 days later, on November 26th, the family gathered again, this time at a church in Fort Worth. It was the first time Alta and Jeffrey embraced their daughter publicly, surrounded by relatives and local media who had followed the case for years. Alta's voice trembled visibly as she said, "I thought I would never see her again." Jeffrey, often reserved and quiet, could only repeat the same phrase over and over. 20 years, 20 years. For Melanie, the experience was both overwhelmingly joyful and deeply disorienting. She had spent her entire life under another name, another history, another identity. Now, in the span of just a few days, everything she thought she knew about her past had shifted fundamentally. "It is overwhelming," she told a reporter. "My heart is full and broken at the same time, but I am happy. Really, really happy." The reunion spread rapidly across national media within hours. Major outlets from the New York Times to BBC News called it a modern miracle of DNA technology. Social networks amplified the story under the headline, "DNA wins after 20 years." But for those directly involved, it was not technology alone that had triumphed here. It was unwavering persistence. The database match would never have existed without 2 decades of absolutely unwavering effort by a family that categorically refused to stop searching. In interviews following the reunion, Scheel emphasized that this was not a case solved by traditional law enforcement at all. It was solved by citizen science and family determination. "It is a completely new kind of investigation," she said. "A father uploads his DNA, and a mystery older than the internet dissolves in days. For those who never gave up on impossible dreams, this story proves that persistence can eventually overcome any obstacle." The Fort Worth Police Department later verified the results through its own laboratory, officially confirming Melissa's identity in early December 2011. The department's public statement was brief but historic. The individual known as Melanie Walden has been confirmed through DNA analysis as Melissa Suzanne Hymeth, reported missing in 1991. This case represents one of the longest successful recoveries of a missing person in Texas history. After the confirmation, Alta and Jeffrey faced the challenge of rebuilding a relationship with a daughter who had lived a full life completely apart from them. The process would take time, but the reunion itself was enough. For Alta, it marked the end of 2 decades of unanswered prayers. "People told me to move on," she said, "but how can a mother move on when she does not know what happened to her child?" For Jeffrey, The moment validated every decision, every tip followed, every test submitted, every late night searching through archives and online forums. 20 years of work, he told a reporter, and it took a little piece of DNA to bring her back. As for Melissa, now reclaiming her birth name, the reunion became the start of a new chapter rather than the end of an old one. In her own words, "I finally know who I am." In the official documentation, the resolution of the case carried a short note under the original file number. Subject located. Case closed. But for those who lived it, the story had no real ending at all, only a beginning that had been delayed by 20 years. And at the center of it all was the simple, undeniable proof that science had finally caught up to hope. That a single email reading "match found" could rewrite history. That persistence, faith, and DNA could bring a lost child home. If you believe in second chances, in science, and in stories that deserve to be told, this is one that will stay with you forever.